They buried the truth beneath polite applause and Christian smiles, but blood remembers what paper tries to erase. Listen closely, because once you hear this, you don't get to unknow it. On an August morning in 1855, a crowd gathered under the Savannah sun, fanning themselves with lace and pride, unaware that history was about to fracture. They thought they were just witnessing another auction, another body sold, another nameless life traded like cattle. But what stepped onto that platform was not just a boy. It was a fracture line in reality, something that did not belong under the laws of ordinary men. His skin, pale as moonlight over a graveyard, his eyes colorless, like something that had never truly lived under the sun. They recoiled, even the cruel ones, even the ones who made a sport of ownership. They whispered, "Bad omen, ghost seed, child of ruin." They believed touching him might stain their bloodlines. They believed even cruelty had limits. They were wrong. No one raised a hand, not a single bid. Even the men who split families for coin stepped back, not in mercy, but in superstition. That's when the fan lifted. Slow, deliberate, like a judge's gavel, sealing a fate. Margaret Dunor. They called her benevolent, charitable, a pillar of Christian virtue with land, wealth, and a hunger no sermon could cleanse. She smiled that day, but not like a savior. She smiled like someone who had finally found the missing piece of a design too monstrous to name. The crowd thought they were witnessing kindness. What they were actually applauding was the opening move of a ritual. That boy, unwanted, unclaimed, untouched by pity, became more than property. He became subject zero in a project whispered about only once, in a burned ledger that should never have survived. A ledger that described bloodlines like breeding stock, purity like a weapon. And a theory so disturbing, it was never presented to any academy or church, because it wasn't science. It wasn't faith. It was something older, something darker. Something that looked at humanity not as souls, but as raw material. And Margaret didn't just believe in it, she built for it. Brick by brick, body by body. What you are about to hear goes beyond slavery, beyond cruelty, beyond the history they allow you to read. You're about to step into the chamber where power strips away morality, where blood becomes currency, and where one woman, under the banner of God, conducted a ritual of flesh. Say nothing yet. Just breathe. Because once we go deeper, you don't come back the same. They said Margaret's land stretched for miles, but what mattered wasn't what could be seen. Power never reveals its true architecture on the surface. The Belmont plantation, with its white columns and manicured paths, was a mask polished for guests, clergy, and auditors. But a mile beyond the main house, down a road, cut through pine and silence, stood the real heart of her domain. Hidden buildings, deliberately mismatched in construction, sourced from different counties so no single labor crew would understand the full design. Every worker was sold the moment his task ended, scattered like ashes to keep the patterns secret. Margaret didn't just build a place, she built a labyrinth designed to erase witnesses. And in that labyrinth, the boy was delivered not as a servant, not even as livestock. He was escorted like an offering. Augustus, the driver, kept his eyes forward the entire time, his hands white-knuckled on the reins. He had transported bodies before, but that day, his silence carried a different weight. He didn't look back at the boy because men like Augustus knew when a thing had already crossed the threshold. Between the living and the accounted, the boy was breathing, but he had entered a place where breath no longer guaranteed existence. Margaret didn't believe in chains. Chains were for owners who feared rebellion. She believed in something far more efficient: structure, psychological containment, isolation so complete that the subject would internalize obedience, not as imposed submission, but as logical survival. She gave him a bed, clean water, even books, a generous prison crafted to rewire him from the inside. Comfort as control. That was her first principle. Remove the whip, replace it with order. Let the subject believe resistance is irrational, not heroic. Break the will not through pain, but through reason. Inside those whitewashed halls, there were rules, spoken calmly, written in neat script. No questions outside assigned lessons. No speech without permission. Knowledge given, but only as she dictated. The boy didn't know it yet, but his mind was being sculpted, carved into a shape Margaret could use. She studied his movements, his learning speed, his eyes when they reacted to certain words. She wasn't just measuring his body, she was mapping his psyche. Every reaction recorded. Every flicker of fear or curiosity logged like data in an experiment. Look around you. Institutions still do this. They remove the obvious chains and replace them with systems. They give comfort, entertainment, distraction, and call it freedom. They learned what Margaret knew, controlled the perception of choice, and you control the man. The boy in that hidden compound wasn't just trapped by walls. He was being prepared, engineered not to serve, but to become the next instrument in her design. And tonight, you will learn what that design truly was. The first thing she stole from him wasn't freedom. It was his name. Names anchor identity. They connect a man to his past, his blood, his origin. A name is a declaration that you are. Margaret understood this with chilling precision. She did not strike him or scream. She simply stopped acknowledging the name Thomas, and within days, the tutors, the driver, even the ledger referred to him only as Subject Zero. That was the moment the boy ceased to be a person in the eyes of Belmont. He became position, purpose, function. When you strip a man of his name, you don't just dehumanize him, you begin rewriting his purpose. Margaret's theory was simple in its brutality. Humanity could be refined like livestock, purified through selective union, managed through classification and elimination. But beneath her cold scientific language was something more predatory. Her journals spoke of purification, ascension, removal of corruption. These were not terms of science, they were terms of ritual, cloaked in academic vocabulary to pass under the banners of charity and research. But there were no peers to review her work, no council to judge it. She hid her findings not out of fear, but out of sovereignty. Truthfully, she did not want approval. She wanted dominion. In her private writings, she described the plantation not as land, but as a crucible, a place where human inheritance could be melted down and reforged. She wrote about ancient lineages, blood marks, traits passed down like curses or blessings. She believed certain blood carried a signal, a latent potential waiting to be amplified. Albinism in her eyes was not a defect, but a purified expression of recessive lineage. She believed the boy's blood was closer to some imagined origin, a cleaner slate upon which she could inscribe her design. At night, she would walk the halls beneath Belmont, where copper-lined chambers held preserved specimens, flesh suspended in glass. Labeled not with names, but with categories. Type A, degenerate. Type B, potential. Type C, aberrant. She recorded their traits with clinical interest, but occasionally, when she believed no one watched, she would linger, almost reverent, like a priest before relics. She did not see horror there. She saw prophecy. This is the part they never teach you. Corruption rarely appears as chaos. It appears as order, measured, calculated, justified. The world looks at plantations and sees cruelty for profit. But profit was never Margaret Dunnor's true motive. What she built was not an empire of labor, but a laboratory of blood, a place designed not to control bodies, but to edit the future itself. And once you understand that the story stops being history and starts becoming a warning, there is a moment when a captive stops looking at the door. When the mind, starved of hope long enough, begins to attach to the walls instead. That moment is when true control begins. Margaret knew this. She didn't rush the boy. She didn't brutalize him openly. She fed him, taught him, gave structure. And slowly his fear began to take a new shape, not of her, but of uncertainty. She introduced lessons not just on reading and arithmetic, but on bloodlines, livestock pairings, the mathematics of breeding. She spoke these things in calm tones, as if discussing weather patterns, while her pen traced charts of lineage like a prayer. In the afternoons, she walked him through her personal library, shelves lined with books that did not belong in the hands of polite society. Anatomical atlases, dissection records from European asylums, handwritten translations of medieval treatises on purity. Some pages were stained. Others were annotated in her careful, measured script. She taught him to read Latin not for art or scripture, but so he could interpret medical diagrams of what she called transference. The boy thought he was learning knowledge. In truth, he was being inducted. Knowledge, when shaped correctly, does not free a man. It binds him more deeply than chains ever could. She seeded concepts in him with deliberate precision. Lineage determines fate. Blood defines value. Purpose is not chosen. It is assigned. These were not lessons. They were conditioning. She never called him a slave. She called him a subject. She spoke of destiny, heritage, obligation. She made servitude sound like destiny. Outside, the world still believed Belmont was just another plantation owned by a grieving widow with too much land and too many secrets. Ministers visited and praised her piety. Physicians wrote her letters, calling her enlightened for educating the lesser breeds. They never saw the hidden corridors. They never smelled the chemical stench beneath the floorboards. They only saw what she allowed them to see. Because power is not about hiding everything, it's about revealing just enough to seem righteous. Every night, the boy returned to his small room with a clean bed and a locked door. He stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the sound of his own name. But it was fading, replaced by charts, diagrams, measurements. He didn't know it yet, but Margaret had already begun the second phase with him. Not physical breeding, but ideological implantation. Before she used his body, she intended to claim his mind. Understand, this control rarely begins with violence. It begins with language, with naming, with redefining what a man believes he is allowed to be. And once you rewrite his inner world, his outer obedience becomes effortless. It was on the 49th day Margaret was precise with numbers. She believed transformation followed cycles, that she shifted from observation to alteration. Until then, the boy had been allowed silence, space to think, to adjust. That was intentional. A mind that believes it still has inner territory will not realize when that territory begins to shrink. But on the 49th day, she entered his room carrying a ledger thicker than any he had seen. Bound in leather, edges worn from years of handling. It was not a book of theory. It was a book of outcomes. She set it before him and told him to read. Inside were names not of slaves, but of subjects dating back generations. Not just from Belmont, but from other estates, other families. She called them choruses. Each entry detailed a life stripped to its bloodline data age. Skin tone, reproductive traits, behavioral reactions under controlled stress. Notes not of ownership, but of experimentation. Some entries ended with the word retired. Others simply ended. She watched him read, not with cruelty, but with fascination, as if she was waiting for something to bloom behind his eyes. When he finally looked up, the question formed in his throat, but never reached his lips. He didn't have to speak it. She said the answer anyway. You are not the first, but you will be the first to understand what you are. It was then he noticed something. Every subject in the ledger had been categorized by physical traits, behavioral reactions. Except one section, a series of entries marked not with numbers, but with a symbol. A circle intersected by a single vertical line, clean, elegant, deliberate. And every one of those marked entries shared a single trait: albinism. She called them the ivory line. Failed prototypes. Attempts to isolate what she termed genetic lucidity. In her writings, she described pigmentless bloodlines as more receptive to reconfiguration. Not a defect, but an opening. A blank canvas upon which a new lineage could be written. The previous ones had been removed, documented, discarded. But she believed Subject Zero could be different, not because of what he was, but because he could be made to know what he was. This was her true refinement. Awareness as a tool of control. Most masters broke bodies to ensure obedience. Margaret sought something far more complete. She wanted the subject to participate in his own transformation. To see the horror and remain, not from force, but from a belief that there was nowhere else he truly belonged. That night, as he lay awake, the boy no longer dreamed of escape. A more dangerous thought had entered him. If I am different, then what am I meant for? And that question is the first lock clicking shut from the inside. Because the moment a captive begins to search for purpose within the chains, he has already begun to forge them himself. From that night onward, Margaret altered the rhythm of his days. Lessons no longer centered on language or arithmetic. They shifted to physiology his own. She introduced him to instruments, calipers for bone measurement, weighted cuffs for strain testing, glass vials that shimmered with preserved samples from those marked before him. She made him record his own data. Every pulse, variation. Every slight tremor in his hands when exposed to certain sounds, smells, or emotional triggers. It felt clinical, neutral, but it was worship disguised as science. He wasn't just being studied, he was being inducted into the logic of his own dismantling. Margaret spoke to him not like a master, but like a mentor, unveiling a sacred architecture. Observe yourself, she said. Only then can you rise above what you were born as. She never used the word slave. She used words like vessel, conduit, refined stock. She was rewriting the hierarchy. In her world, the worst fate was not bondage, it was being ordinary. And slowly, a terrible seed took root in him. What if she was right? What if those before him had failed because they did not understand the role they were meant to play? Purpose is a powerful sedative. Even suffering becomes tolerable when wrapped in destiny. One evening, as the cicadas screamed outside in the sweltering heat, she led him down a corridor he had never seen. The walls were lined with symbols burned into the wood circles intersected by lines, spirals, branching patterns like family trees turning in on themselves. At the end of the hall stood a door made of iron, cold and wrung against the warmth of the southern night. She placed his hand on the handle not to force him forward, but to make him choose. You have read their names. You have seen their endings. But you, Subject Zero, you will write the first beginning. In that moment, something shifted. Not in the room. In him. He wasn't being dragged. He was being invited. And that more than chains, more than fear, is the most perfect form of control. When a prisoner walks willingly into the final chamber, believing it is a throne room. The iron door groaned as it opened, not loudly, but with the muted weight of something built to last longer than memory. Inside, the air was colder, unnaturally still, as if even the wind refused to cross the threshold. The chamber wasn't large. It was deliberate, circular, with walls of dark stone, unlike anything found on the Belmont grounds. No windows. No echo. Sound felt absorbed, as though the room itself was listening. At the center stood a single chair bolted into the floor, not crude like a restraint device, but crafted with unsettling grace. Polished metal, curved to fit a human form with precision. Too precise, as though it wasn't made to hold a random body, but his. Around it were engraved concentric rings on the floor, each marked with the same symbol from the ledger, the circle split by a vertical line. But here, something new was added. Faint grooves connecting the rings to the chair, as if fluid's blood were meant to travel through them like veins in stone. Margaret stepped inside, her footsteps careful, reverent. She didn't look at the chair like an instrument. She looked at it the way a believer looks at an altar. Every structure has a heart, she said softly. This was built for yours. She did not ask him to sit. She waited. A long moment passed. A moment long enough for two truths to collide within him. 1. This was a place of ending. Everything in the room felt final, like a mouth waiting to close. 2. This was a place of crowning. A part of him shaped by weeks of conditioning, isolation. Knowledge used as a needle whispered that to refuse the chair was to reject not captivity, but significance. He approached, slowly. Not because she commanded, because something inside him leaned forward. Margaret did not smile. She observed. Her eyes glinted not with madness, but with calculation finally reaching its moment of proof. "Sit," she said, not loudly, not forcefully, more like a verdict being read. His knees bent. The metal was cold against his spine, fitting him too perfectly. The grooves in the floor seemed to pulse faintly, as if waiting for activation, as if they could taste proximity. Margaret stepped behind him. He felt her presence steady and ceremonial. She did not bind him. She did not need to. That was the second lock, the moment compliance becomes ritual. Outside, the world carried on. Fields, workers, sermons, polite society. But beneath the earth, in a chamber built for a bloodline, no history book would ever name a new lineage didn't begin with birth. It began with surrender. The chair did not clamp shut. There were no shackles, no straps, no iron biting into flesh. That absence was intentional restraint would imply resistance. And Margaret wanted something far more complete. She wanted alignment. From the wall, she withdrew a device encased in glass. It looked nothing like the crude tools used by plantation surgeons. It was elegant. Constructed with polished brass, glass cylinders, a thin needle threaded through tubing like a vein outside the body. It was too refined to belong to this time. Prepared as though waiting for only one subject, one moment. She held it with both hands, not like a tool, but like a relic. "There is a lie people cling to," she said quietly, her voice reverberating against the stone. "They believe blood carries memory. It does not. Blood carries potential. Memory must be written." The boy's breath slowed. He wasn't trembling. That frightened him more than fear itself, the numb clarity that settled in. It wasn't acceptance. It was something closer to appointment. Margaret stepped into the ring nearest the chair. The moment her foot crossed the etched line, the faintest vibration hummed through the chamber floor, as though the structure recognized her, a keeper, a conductor. She lifted the glass vial to the dim light. Inside it, the preserved blood shimmered with an opalescent sheen, not red, not alive, but reactive, as if waiting to answer a question that had never been spoken aloud. "These," she said, gesturing to the symbols around them, "are not restraints. They are conduits, a design for inheritance. Those before you failed because they could not see beyond the language of captivity. They resisted. You see the pattern?" She extended the needle toward him. Not like a threat, like a coronation. For a heartbeat, his mind screamed, "This is how they die. This is how they end." But another thought, quieter, more dangerous, rose beneath it. "Then let me end differently than they did." His hand lifted, not to push the needle away, to bring it closer. Margaret did not smile. Her expression was something far colder: satisfaction. "Good," she whispered. "A subject only becomes a lineage when he consents to the design." And as the needle touched skin, the chamber seemed to exhale stone metal. And bloodlines holding their breath for the moment history would never record, the first willing prototype. The needle slid beneath the skin with a precision that felt almost gentle. No tearing, no pain. Just a pressure light, controlled, followed by a spreading cold that moved through his veins like ink through parchment. The grooves in the floor responded. It was subtle at first, a faint shimmer pulsing outward from the chair, traveling along the etched lines like something alive. The rings on the stone did not glow. They shifted, as if the chamber itself were waking after a long, deliberate sleep. This was not medicine. This was activation. The blood from the vial, pale, iridescent, didn't mix naturally with his. It resisted at first, a foreign current meeting an established river. His pulse jumped. His vision sharpened, then blurred, then sharpened again with unnatural clarity. Sound warped, stretching silence into something heavy and textured. He could hear the chamber breathe. Margaret watched, not with glee, with calculated awe, like an architect witnessing her blueprint rise into form. "Do not fight it," she said calmly. "Inheritance is not received. It is submitted to." He focused on his breathing. Inhale, exhale. But the rhythm no longer felt like his. Each breath echoed, layered, as if two pulses were trying to synchronize inside one body. The air tasted metallic, electric, and then it happened. A memory that was not his flashed behind his eyes. A corridor, stone, torches, hands, pale hands like his pressed against cold walls, etched with the same.
Nice.
A voice, distant and genderless, speaking in a tongue he had never learned yet understood. Not words, instruction. His heart jolted. For a moment, he wasn't sitting in a chamber beneath Belmont. He was somewhere older, somewhere that felt less like a place and more like a precedent. Then, like a wave pulling back after impact, the vision receded, leaving only the echo of a single idea. This has been attempted before. Not here, not by Margaret. By others? Long before plantation, before ledger, before science put on the mask of purity. He looked up at Margaret. She saw the change in his eyes. And for the first time since the process began, she knelt, not out of worship, out of acknowledgement. "Now," she murmured, voice low with something almost reverent, "you understand why I chose you. You are not just the next in the ivory line." She placed one hand on the cold stone. The chamber seemed to listen. "You are the first to hear it," answer back. The chamber fell silent. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of recognition. The kind that settles over a battlefield before the first sword is drawn. The kind that exists just before a name is spoken that was never meant to return to human lips. He could feel it now. Not power, not strength. Alignment. It was like every breath he had ever taken, from his first cry on the auction block to this moment beneath the earth, been leading to this single inhale. The chamber's sigils pulsed once more, not with light, but with acknowledgement. Ancient geometry obeyed. Stone responded. Blood remembered. Margaret stayed kneeling, her head lowered, not in submission to him, but to what was speaking through him. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, trembled with reverence as she whispered, "The lion is awake." The boy rose. Not from strength, from inevitability. Each step forward felt like stepping deeper into a bloodline that existed outside of time. He could feel the ledgers burned by trembling hands in 1861. He could see the forgotten graves hidden under pine roots. Their markers rotted, but their memory imprinted in the earth. He could hear the whispers of others like him, not albinos, but anomalies scattered across history like misfiled pages in a forbidden text. Margaret's experiment was never hers. She was only a caretaker of a key she could not use. He understood now. Power doesn't come from control. It comes from refusing to be defined. And as he stood before the stone altar, a construct older than the plantation that had been built on top of it, like a parasite, he placed his hand on its surface. The stone was not cold. It was waiting. A low vibration rippled through the air, vibrating through his bones like a second heartbeat. The chamber walls expanded not physically, but perceptually, as if space itself bent to accommodate something ancient returning. Margaret looked up, tears in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of completion. "You are no longer Thomas," she said, voice steady now. "Names are chains. Chains are for property." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. The chamber spoke for him, a resonant pulse that felt like thunder trapped beneath the skin. And if you're still here, if you followed this descent all the way down, then I want you to mark yourself not as a viewer, but as one who has seen beneath the surface. Go to the comments and write this phrase 2 times without explanation. I do not inherit chains. I inherit fire. I do not inherit chains. I inherit fire. Because once a man speaks that truth, even in a whisper typed beneath a video, something shifts. Not in the world, in him. And when a man changes like that, the world has no defense. This is fear liturgy, and you've just crossed the threshold.